Once in the plane, it was beginning to get dark. I can hear the pilots cranking the engines, the cough and firing as they caught and revved up. The pilots pushed the throttles to proper RPMs, checked their maps and gauges. The C-47 shook and vibrated as though eager, and we were silent to the man. The ship farthest to our left added throttle, moved forward towards the runway, did a right 90, and paraded left to right before us as vanguard, moving between us and the runway as it headed to the right end of the runway and takeoff point. We watched the flames of exhaust in the growing dark as the ship filled with 101st Eagle men loaded with tools of war shadowed past. It became our turn. The ship shuddered and moved, turned right, and followed the ships in line before us. Our pilot firewalled the throttles, and we went as over a bumpy country road, heading towards the skies and Normandy. When the gear cleared the ground, we were airborne. We cheered as one, breaking the silence. We were going to war. And that is a quote from Private First Class Donald R. Burgett of A Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment. And that was the night of June the 5th, 1944. And that quote is found in one of my absolute favorite history books of all time that I have read so far, and that is the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles in World War II, written by Mark Bando. And in my opinion, Mark Bando is perhaps the finest 101st Airborne historian out there. If you are studying the 101st Airborne, or in any matter, airborne operations of the Second World War, Mark Bando's name becomes ubiquitous with the experience of the 101st due to the extents he has gone to document their story. The book I'm reading from today was given to me many years ago for Christmas by a favorite uncle. It has an incredible amount of high-quality photographs, which made, for a young person such as myself, the book very appealing. However, as is not often the case with books containing such vibrant photography, the textual content and historical content of this book is incredible. And this comes directly from Mark Bando's ability to convey the history in a lively, personal, interesting, and incredibly detailed way that makes this history accessible to anybody, even a 15-year-old kid who is mainly in it for the pictures. As a matter of fact, there's so much content in this book, I can't get to it all today. I am going to read from the first sections of the book, which document the training and Normandy operations of the 101st Airborne encapsulated within this text. The book goes on to detail Market Garden in Holland and Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge, and the 101st Airborne's participation in the drive into Germany. The book is a general overview of the 101st in the Second World War, as the title says. I don't have time today to bring you the whole book, nor do I want to, because I can't bring you some of the most thrilling content of this text, which are these amazing photographs, many of them never before published. Mark Bando is able to bring this unique content to his work because Mr. Bando spent thousands and thousands of hours with the veterans, gathering their knowledge, recording excerpts from interviews such as what I just read that only he had gleaned from them. So that makes his work incredibly valuable. Mark Bando also curates an online discussion board and exhibition of his own personal collection of artifacts at his own website, which I will link in the description. I highly advise anybody interested in World War II airborne operations, especially the 101st, to familiarize themselves with his website. And as I said, Mark Bando spent a lot of time with veterans. And the veterans imparted onto him some artifacts that were there with them at D-Day and beyond. So in the back of this book, which is particularly interesting, are incredible photographs of some of the more interesting items from his own collection, his own personal museum. And he includes advice for burgeoning collectors in this difficult field. Advice many times I wish myself had taken to heart. I digress, which is often the case with me. I'm going to move on to the book, to the first chapter, which talks about the training that airborne men get into. I'm going to try not to digress too much during this podcast, but I will say at the beginning, bear with me. Airborne operations, tactics, and equipment are a specific interest of mine and have been since I was very young. And this book was instrumental in founding that and informing me not only of the actual history, but of how to collect the equipment, how to write personal history mixed with both historical insight from the historian as well as the actual words from the men. And I've brought books in the past, such as Passchendaele, The Sacrificial Ground, which were entirely composed of the words of the veterans. And they can get a little bit difficult at times to follow. Mark Bando does an excellent job at mixing both the veterans' accounts and his own historical digression to bring you as accurate a picture of the events as possible. Coupled with the amazing photography only he was able to collect often from veterans themselves. This book has an incredible amount of knowledge that one podcast could never hope to bring to you. I'm going to link this book and its for sale area where you can buy it in the description so you too can experience this awesome text. If you're into airborne or paratroopers, or for that matter Operation Overlord, or just World War II, this is an essential book. Mark Bando has many other books on the 101st, picture books and textual accounts that go into more detail. But this is, as I said, and as the title says, an overview of the 101st in World War II. And it is still incredible how much detail Mr. Bando gets into just in this book. So without further ado, Chapter 1. Training and Maneuvers. Benjamin Franklin predicted airborne warfare long ago, writing that 10,000 men descending from the clouds might not in many places do an infinite deal of mischief before a force could be brought together to repel them. Franklin's 18th century idea envisioned 2 men each in 500 balloons as a means of deployment long before airplanes or parachutes became a reality. It was perhaps fitting that the first successful airplanes would be tested, invented, and flown by this visionary founding father's countrymen. The very first use of parachute jumpers as soldiers was slated to involve U.S. infantrymen from the 1st Division as early as 1918, but the armistice ending World War I forestalled that proposed mission. American military parachutists would eventually be deployed in combat when the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion dropped into North Africa in November of 1942. In the interim years, parachuting had mostly been confined to amusement rides at world's fairs and stunt descents from air shows. Despite small-scale experiments in the late 1920s, the U.S. military didn't take another serious look at the potential of deploying armed parachute forces until the Russians made mass drops of paratroopers in the late 1930s. With war clouds gathering in Europe, the German army experimented with paratroop forces prior to their invasion of Poland in late 1939. The Germans demonstrated during their blitzkrieg in the West that airborne forces deployed in small groups could seize key objectives such as bridges and even fortresses. The invasion of Crete further demonstrated to the world, albeit at a costly price to the German invaders, what airborne troopers could do. The Americans and British soon copied the German example with experimental, small-scale forces of their own. A U.S. parachute test platoon was formed in 1940 and began testing various equipment and parachute types. Whereas the Germans made paratroopers part of their Luftwaffe, the Americans decided that the primary job of its paratroopers would involve ground combat. After the initial experiments of the test platoon, a number of volunteer parachute battalions were activated and men were accepted into them on a strictly volunteer basis. In addition to the glamour of belonging to an elite, death-defying unit, paratroopers would be paid $50 extra per month as jump pay for enlisted men and $100 extra per month for commissioned officers. The earliest battalions were the 501st at Panama and the 502nd at Fort Benning, Georgia, later at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Glider infantry and artillery units were also formed, and a new tradition of elite warfare had been born into the U.S. Army. The famous 82nd Infantry Division at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, was the first large-scale unit marked for airborne status. In World War I, the 82nd had been the home outfit of the legendary Sergeant Alvin York. In 1942, the new division was loaded with a combination of old Army regulars and recently conscripted draftees brought into the Army by selective service. After Hitler's forces attacked Western Europe and then invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, it seemed only a matter of time before the United States became directly involved. Initially, U.S. airborne tacticians visualized small-scale deployments of platoons, companies, or battalions of paratroopers with limited objectives. But deployment of entire divisions to open the second front became a more and more appealing idea. As early as 1942, Allied planners were conceiving and designing ways to penetrate Hitler's Atlantic Wall with test raids on the German-held coast. The Red Army was engaged on a massive scale along a 2,000-mile front, and Russia was clamoring for the Allies to relieve some of the pressure by advancing on the Nazi homeland from the west. Starting methodically in North Africa to drive Rommel's Afrika Korps from the desert, the Western Allies pushed north into Sicily, then staged for multiple landings along the coast of Italy. Brutal fighting in the Mediterranean theater eventually slowed to a long war of attrition. And that is the very beginning of the first chapter, where Mark Bando does a very succinct and informative job of detailing the genesis of the airborne concept in the U.S. military and its early application. He also succinctly describes the state of affairs by the time the 101st Airborne would be employed in Operation Overlord on D-Day, June 6, 1944. There was incredible pressure on the Allies to invade from France, and the plan had been in the works since 1942. It had various names. Eventually, the name it was given, the massive operation and invasion of the French coastline, was called Operation Overlord. And this is the operation in which the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions would play a key part. The 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion as mentioned briefly in that introduction, did indeed jump multiple times in North Africa, and then again and again in Italy. And those early lessons from those often disastrous encounters of that small unit being employed as essentially a guinea pig brought about highly successful tactics that later large division-sized units such as the 101st and 82nd would capitalize upon. Moving along in the book, Mark Bando begins to describe not only the parachute training but also the glider-borne personnel who would accompany the parachutists in their gliders into combat. Going back to the book, all glider-borne personnel, whether infantry, medics, engineers, or artillerymen, were not initially volunteers. The Army could order a soldier to enter a glider as surely as any other vehicle, such as a jeep or a truck. And while glider riders suffered a lot of casualties from bad landings and more serious mishaps, they were not entitled to receive hazardous duty pay. To further aggravate the situation, paratroops within the same division treated glider troops with disdain, and many fights erupted from the inevitable resentment. Glider-borne personnel were required to wear old-fashioned ankle gaiters with their low shoes, while paratroopers received tall jump boots with capped toes and high ankles, taking 12 eyelets to lace them up. The jumpers were also held to a more rigorous physical training involving thousands of push-ups, long-distance runs, and speed hikes covering extreme distances in incredibly short times. So, on another level, the daredevil volunteer parachutists felt entitled to scorn all soldiers they considered to be of lesser condition, courage, and motivation. Unfortunately, glider-borne troops also fell into this category. Not until the jumpers saw countless gliders smashed into hedgerows in Normandy, with their fragile human cargoes impaled and mangled, did the paratroopers' disdain for glider troopers stop. The situation was eventually mitigated after hazardous duty pay was approved for these brave soldiers, and a special badge was devised to recognize glider training and combat insertion via glider. And that's an interesting aspect. Not many who have not served in the military would be able to understand. There is a certain amount of inter-unit competition that's often fostered to raise morale, but early in the war, paratroopers held themselves to a very high regard. They wore special jump boots that became a status symbol. And Mark Bando has wonderful photography of men lined up receiving their brand new jump boots, and you can see on their faces how proud they are. He has other photographs of men at their party called the Prop Blast Party, after they've completed their 5 training jumps out of a real aircraft, where they're wearing their brand new shiny wings. Again, the pride is evident, and another reason to own this book, because the photography Mr. Bando includes is incredible. Now, returning to the text, Mark Bando goes on to detail the training that men of the 101st Airborne had to endure, as well as paratroop training as it was at that point in the war. The 82nd Airborne had already gone through, for the most part, and trained its men through these fashions and methods at Fort Benning, Georgia. And after the addition of the 101st Airborne Division, another camp was needed, and this camp was constructed at Toccoa, Georgia. And Camp Toccoa became an infamous name in U.S. Special Operations history. Back to the book. Unlike basic at other camps, Toccoa Basic included familiarization with parachute equipment, exit training from a mock-up C-47 aircraft door, and jumps from a 34-foot-tall tower. The student jumper, wearing a harness attached to a cable, jumped off the tower and dropped 15 feet before the slack played out. He rode a 45-degree angle to the ground, sliding along a slanted cable system. The tower was about the height of a telephone pole, close enough to the ground to make the mortal danger seem all the more real, unlike the false sense of security one gets from gazing out of an airplane window at the seemingly unreal and soft-looking landscape below. Moving on in the book to some of the more specific elements of adversity that the 101st had to face in their own training at Camp Toccoa, Georgia. Long, punishing runs and endless physical training were primary features of Toccoa basic training. Like other basic trainees, the new soldiers learned the elementals of weapons handling and firing, marching, drill, and general soldiering. Their rifle range was about a 50-mile truck ride away from Clemson, South Carolina. When one battalion commander decided to march his troops back to Toccoa from Clemson, a competition started between the battalions to see which could march the furthest and the fastest. In late 1942, the battalions of the 506 departed from Camp Toccoa one at a time to attend parachute training at the parachute school in Fort Benning, Georgia. The 1st Battalion rode there on a train, while Lieutenant Colonel Strayer's 2nd Battalion marched 118 miles from Camp Toccoa to Atlanta, Georgia, about half the total distance, and then boarded a train for the rest of the trip. Colonel Sink himself did not participate in this grueling march. Instead, he breezed past his marching troops in an open limousine. This caused considerable resentment among the troops who witnessed it. Lieutenant Colonel Robert L. Wolverton's 3rd Battalion rode trains from Camp Toccoa to Atlanta, then completed the trip to Fort Benning by marching the last 138 miles. Private First Class Donald E. Zahn from Minnesota was a member of the 60mm mortar squad of 1st Platoon, Headquarters 506, and had been captain of the track team at his high school. Before the march from Atlanta to Fort Benning, Zahn convinced all the members of his squad to paint the soles of their feet with methylite, a trick he had learned from his old track coach. This toughened the skin on the soles of the men's feet and helped prevent blistering. Lieutenant Colonel Wolverton, West Point, 1938, the 3rd Battalion commander, suffered terribly on this march, but insisted on making the long walk with his troops. At each rest break, medics attended Wolverton's bloody feet, applying salve and bandages as best as they could. The interpret officer alternated walking and riding for a stretch in an ambulance, but he earned great admiration from his men for the gutsy determination in completing the march with them. And not only is that an example of Mark Bando's meticulous research and individual names and individual actions, which he includes in his general history to make it pop, it's also an example of good and bad leadership. The Colonel Sink, riding past in his limousine caused resentment, where the Lieutenant Colonel insisted on doing the march despite his bloody feet. And at a certain point he couldn't even march anymore, so he rode along in an ambulance, gaining the respect of his men. That is how to be a leader. And that also is an example of the typical man who volunteered to jump out of airplanes when it was a burgeoning technology. The kind of men who would have to be paid jump pay because, quite frankly, it was life-threatening to just do the job before you hit the ground, before you entered into combat. Really incredible individuals in this book brings that to light at every possible moment. Moving ahead into the book, after the men finish their jump training at Fort Benning and then ship out to England to prepare for Operation Overlord, Mark Bando does an excellent job at detailing the formation of Pathfinder units in the 101st Airborne. I've done a bit of independent research on the formation of Pathfinders, and I could talk about that for a whole nother podcast, and maybe I will. But for now, I'm going to let Mark Bando's excellent words on the 101st Airborne describe the contrary reality of the Pathfinders to most people's idealized imagery of who they were. Back to the book. Early in 1944, a divisional Pathfinder school was established at Nottingham under command of Captain Frank L. Lillyman. The mission of the Pathfinders would be to jump into combat ahead of the rest of the parachute echelon. Using color-coded lights and radar, these trained Pathfinders would guide the main serials of planes to their drop zones in complete darkness. Prior to his assignment as head of the 101st Pathfinder School, Lillyman had been company commander of Item Company of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The outspoken Lillyman had a caustic, critical sense of humor, like Lieutenant Colonel Ewell of the 501st. This trait did not endear him to many other officers, including his regimental commander, Colonel George Van Horn Mosley. Captain Robert Clements of Company G overheard Old Mo refer to Lillyman as a arrogant smartass, adding, "I don't want that son of a bitch in my regiment." Thus, Captain Ivan Ray Hirschner assumed command of Item 502 as Lillyman departed for Pathfinder duty. Likewise, many of the men who ended up in Lillyman's new unit were not the elite of the division, but rather were individuals who companies could spare them. This did not take anything away from the courage and dedication of the Pathfinders, but there are some misconceptions about how those who ended up in this unit did so, and how much of their heroic mystique came out of preceding everyone else into the battle zone. Many of the volunteers were busted former non-commissioned officers, while others did not really volunteer. They were individuals, such as Austrian-born T5 Joe Haller and his two buddies, Joe Devanowicz and David Hadley, known in the communications platoon of headquarters 1st 501st as the Three Kings. Their company commander, Captain John Simmons, had said he heard Haller making sarcastic pro-Hitler master race jokes, and Simmons considered all three of these men to be undesirables. He therefore put their names forth as volunteers for Pathfinder duty, of which they were informed after the fact. They still could have refused, but they chose not to, making them volunteers of a sort. Men who already had training in communications, like the Three Kings, were also given preference for this assignment because they were familiar with radio equipment and had learned Morse code. Each rifle company in the 3 PIRs, Parachute Infantry Regiments, was requested to ask for Pathfinder volunteers. In Fox 501st, a batch of volunteers from 1st Platoon and one from 2nd filled the available slots before any 3rd Platoon men even heard about Pathfinder duty. Likewise, in Item 506, where the entire 2nd Squad of the 2nd Platoon jumped at the chance and filled the quota of Pathfinder volunteers for that company before the others had a chance. Shortly before D-Day, additional personnel were sent from each company to jump in with the Pathfinders and provide security for them during their signaling duties. The men who volunteered for security duty were not regarded as true Pathfinders by the men who had trained for months at Nottingham and had learned to operate the Eureka radar sets and halophane lights. However, the security personnel were entitled to wear the Pathfinder's winged torch insignia on their left sleeve, and were generally considered to be true Pathfinders. Even the security personnel weren't always volunteers, such as Lieutenant Reed Pelfrey, who had gotten on the wrong side of his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Cole of West Point, 1939. Cole volunteered him for Pathfinder security duty, in much the same way Captain Simmons volunteered the Three Kings, shortly before D-Day. He was sent to Nottingham with a private who had recently been busted from the grade of sergeant and had not really volunteered in the normal sense of the term. Easy 501st troopers Robert Molesky and John Buska talked about their chances of surviving D-Day, the D-Day night jump, and decided the odds would be better if they arrived in the combat zone ahead of the main serials at a time when the Germans were not yet alerted. This theory convinced them to volunteer to serve as Pathfinder security personnel, although in reality their plan would be negated by a strong and alert response from the German troops positioned near Drop Zone D. Buska and Molesky received plenty of enemy fire as they descended near the German hornet's nest of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. Regardless of how and why they ended up in this role, the Pathfinders of D-Day have become folk heroes by virtue of their first-in status. Several sticks of Pathfinder personnel, drawn from each parachute regiment, would jump into France between 0:15 and 0:45 hours on D-Day to mark drop zones A, C, and D with amber, green, and red lights. And that's just an incredible passage there, recorded by Mark Bando, describing individuals who had not necessarily volunteered in the classic sense of the term for Pathfinder duty. And he goes on to refute the interesting role Pathfinders have now taken in modern history of D-Day and in airborne operations in general. Again, it's content like this that makes Bando's work all the more applicable for anybody trying to study this element of World War II military history. Back to the book. The 502nd PIR, slated for landing furthest north on Drop Zone A, was the first regiment to jump. While much of their 1st and 3rd Battalions landed in the general vicinity of their objectives, the entire 2nd Battalion homed in on the wrong Pathfinder signal and dropped 502 on Drop Zone C, far south of their target, the coastal guns near Saint-Martin-de-Varaville. The bulk misdrop of 502 personnel proved to be of little consequence, as their objective at Saint-Martin-de-Varaville had already been abandoned by the German forces after a May 26 bombing had informed them that the gun battery was pinpointed by the Allies. Conversely, many planes carrying 506 intended for Drop Zone C homed on the Drop Zone A signal and dropped that battalion between Fauquarville and Auduville-la-Hubert. I'm going to apologize right now to anybody who can speak French. I'm trying. I'm trying, folks. Oh, gosh. I've read these names many times, and I still am not 100% on the pronunciation. I'm apologizing right now. Bear with me, folks. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, slated for landing furthest north on Drop Zone A, was the first regiment to jump. While much of their 1st and 3rd Battalions landed in the general vicinity of their objectives, the entire 2nd Battalion homed in on the wrong Pathfinder signal and dropped 2nd Battalion 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment on Drop Zone C, far south of their target, the coastal guns near Saint-Martin-de-Varaville. The bulk misdrop of 502 proved to be of little consequence, as their objective at Saint-Martin-de-Varaville had already been abandoned by German forces after a May 26th bombing had informed them that the gun battery was pinpointed by the Allies. Conversely, many planes carrying 506 intended for Drop Zone C homed in on Drop Zone A signal and dropped that battalion between Fauquarville and Auduville-la-Hubert. Many paratroopers of that serial received the green light too early and landed near Saint-Mary-Glisse. One serial of 45 planes of the 301st and 302nd Squadrons, bearing Lieutenant Colonel A. Ballard's 501st, had the best drop of any 101st Airborne unit that night, landing correctly in a concentrated area on Drop Zone D. This group was the second from last of the 101st serials to jump, between 0134 hours and 0137. There is a reason why this serial managed to retain formation when approaching the drop zone. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel William Parkhill, was deputy commander of the 431st Troop Carrier Group, and he was leading this serial. As they approached the cloud banks at the west edge of the peninsula, he went against orders and made a spontaneous decision to drop in altitude to 300 feet. All the other planes in that serial followed his example. In this way, those 45 planes flew under the cloud banks and maintained perfect formation. After clearing the cloudy area, they rose in altitude to the requisite 750 feet for the green light, slowed to 105 miles per hour, and made a textbook drop. Staff Sergeant Joe Kennedy of E-501st was aboard a plane named Pee-wee, piloted by Lieutenant Fred Terrick Trenek of the 301st TCS. Kenny wrote in 1972, "Just before the green light I heard another trooper screaming at me. I had not hooked my static line to the steel cable in the plane and would have gone out the door without realizing it. On the green light, our pilot, Lieutenant Trenek, slowed the plane down, lifted the tail, and we exited." Few paratroopers have been able to remember the name of their D-Day pilot, but Lieutenant Trenek's exemplary performance made quite an impression on Kenny. While over the drop zone, Trenek saw a lone C-47 that had strayed from another serial, flying head-on through the 301st serial in the opposite direction. Drop Zone D proved to be the hottest of the 101st drop zones. The Germans fired a lot of machine guns, rifles, and a few 20 millimeters. Despite the great volume of small caliber fire, there was an absence of larger anti-aircraft fire. They also sent up white flares over the drop zone, which lit the area almost like daylight as the troopers were exiting their planes. Troopers looking up from the ground could clearly see the dramatic sight of subsequent jumpers coming out the doors of troop transports. This was unique to Drop Zone D. After all 101st units were on the ground in France, Pathfinders of the 82nd Airborne jumped to mark their drop zones. The serials carrying the 505th, 507th, and 508th Parachute Infantry Regiments followed behind them. The 377th Field Artillery Battalion experienced the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion experienced the most catastrophic misdrops of any unit that parachuted into Normandy on D-Day. Only 3 of their 12 75mm pack howitzers were even located. One of those was bogged down in the mud of swamp and could not be dragged out. Another was assembled and loaded on a road near Valognes, but after firing one round had to be abandoned because the crew faced being surrounded by superior enemy forces. Only one of the 12 howitzers came to ground close enough to be consolidated to the consolidated 101st Bridgehead to be recovered and utilized. Scattered artillerymen, most of whom had been deposited on the wrong map 6 to 15 miles north of Drop Zone A, would have to fight for survival as infantrymen. Many would be killed or captured before reaching friendly lines, and the 377th suffered more casualties in Normandy as a result of the misdrops than they sustained in the rest of World War II. I wanted to include that element because Mark does an excellent job at bringing the terror of that jump of that particular unit to light, and also something not many people consider when they think about D-Day and paratroopers. They were dropping in a parachute field artillery battalion of 12 75mm pack howitzers, and I've inspected an original 75mm pack howitzer of the kind that would be dropped into Normandy on that night. Smaller than your regular howitzer, and it could be broken down into components that could be loaded into cargo containers, slung underneath the aircraft, and then as the first paratrooper exits the door, he would pull a handle that would release the containers on the aircraft. So then those in separate parachutes would float to Earth, theoretically, with the stick of men jumping after it. As is obviously the case, those pack howitzer bundles were often not found, especially when the drop was at night. Back to the book. Moving ahead. Once the 101st Airborne Division, the 82nd Airborne, and their glider-borne units made it to the ground, the iconic hedgerow fighting of Normandy began. And Mr. Bando does a wonderful job at putting you there amidst the hedgerows with these men. Back to the book. The hedgerows along the road were 3 to 4 feet high, and they cut you off as though you were in a separate room. As I knelt down and started making notes of unit identification, I looked up and saw that my former companions had left, and I was all alone. As I continued taking notes, suddenly out of the corner of my eye, I saw a German infantryman jumping down from one of the hedgerows with a rifle in his hand. As I dived into the nearest ditch along the road, I saw him do the same thing on the opposite side of the road. There was no movement to be seen or heard, so I began to crawl backwards in the ditch, back to the crossroads. As soon as I got to the corner, I saw our men standing around, waiting to move out. I told them what had happened, and we ran back around the bend, but the German soldier had apparently done the same thing I did, and backed the other way in his ditch to get back to his comrades. Since we now knew that the Germans had seen us and knew our location, we wasted no time in heading southeast to our assembly area. This was on the morning of D-Day, and it was a warm, beautiful, sunny day. And that was the account of Captain Joseph Pangurl of the 502 PIR, describing the unique conditions of fighting in the hedgerow territory of Normandy, where you could come face to face with an enemy soldier at any time. Moving ahead in the book. The jungle-like nature of fighting in the Normandy bocage country sometimes resulted in unexpected close encounters. In his book, Happy Landings, Richard Farmer Turner of B506 wrote, "I was leaning up against a tree in the hedgerow country. Another man in B Company came up and said to me in effect, 'Get out of the way.' He shoved me somewhat, and I moved out of the way quickly. He pointed his rifle straight up, perpendicular to the ground, and fired. Lo and behold, a sniper came tumbling down out of the tree, as an animal would when shot during a hunt in the United States. We had one less enemy to contend with. I should note that in the Normandy hedgerow country, one could observe many wooden platforms and paths built in some of the taller trees to make it easier for snipers to move about." A similar account comes from John Cleaver, who was laying in a ditch at the base of a hedgerow during a break in the fighting. Sitting beside him was John Granados, who had a bayonet affixed atop his M1 rifle. Suddenly, a German came over the top of the hedgerow and dropped down directly onto Granados, who simply held his bayonet upright and impaled the enemy soldier. The German died almost immediately, but Granados had difficulty removing his bayonet from the dead man's body. Cleaver suggested he fire the weapon, which proved useful in facilitating that removal. And that's another vignette Mark Bando brings to us of what it's like in the claustrophobic and close-in Normandy bocage hedgerow country. And back to the book. Although General Taylor had promised the 101st troopers that they would be relieved after 3 hard days of fighting, this was not to be the reality. After June 9th, a new and urgent mission presented itself, with most of the troops coming across Utah Beach either being diverted north towards the port prize of Cherbourg or west to cut the escape route of Germans stationed in the Continian Peninsula. Survivors of the 101st Airborne would get the assignment of capturing the city of Carentan, France, while elements of the 506th held an east-west line above the Douve River. The 501st and 327th worked their way around the east side of Carentan, mostly encircling it after crossing the Douve River closer to the canal, closer to the channel. After the 502nd secured a bridgehead to the north outskirts of Carentan, the 506 would encircle the town from the west. Carentan lies at the base of the peninsula, and taking it as soon as possible was essential to linking up with the beach-landed troops from Omaha Beach. Also, there was concern that German reinforcements gravitating towards Utah Beach would push through Carentan to the coast, driving a significant wedge between the two American beachheads. Michael's 502nd PIR drew the assignment, with Lieutenant Colonel Cole's 3rd Battalion leading the way down the main road into Carentan from the north. The most direct route into Carentan from the high ground below Saint-Cum-du-Mont was down the N13 road, which traverses several miles of pasture land before entering Carentan from the north. Because those pastures were flooded in 1944, this road comprised a causeway under which 4 rivers crossed at right angles. The 3 northernmost bridges came in close succession, over the Jordan River, the Douve River, the Le Gros, and finally, after a longer interval, came the last bridge before Carentan, over the Madeline River. By June the 10th, the second bridge had been blown out by the engineers of Fallschirmjäger 6, and the 502nd troops who crossed the Douve did so on an improvised bridge made of planks and wires scavenged from a nearby fence. Moving along the N13 causeway single file, Cole's troops were virtually without cover. Crawling along the road or its shoulder made the troopers perfect targets for enemy soldiers positioned at varying distances to the west of the causeway. The screaming eagles who drew this assignment could only wonder what cruel vagaries of fate conspired to place them in such a hellish predicament. As most of them edged down the right side of the causeway, flat on their bellies, many slid down into the cold water at the edge of the inundated pasture land to avoid being silhouetted. The urgency to take Carentan as soon as possible was aggravated by the primitive state of communications between fighter aircraft bases in the United Kingdom and the front line below Saint-Cum-du-Mont. The result was that the Air Corps could not be given an accurate assignment to provide air support to the advance of Cole's battalion. The American armor had come ashore and was diverted elsewhere. Artillery support was minimal. So this is one of the great acts of incredible bravery, where these paratroopers who had been told they would only be on the ground for 3 days, which is a good idea when you're employing a highly trained, highly specialized, and lightly equipped group such as airborne paratroopers, they seize their initial objectives, and then they are replaced by ground pounders, guys who are supported by tanks, artillery, and aircraft, properly equipped to endure long periods of combat. This was not the case. It turned out that this town of Carentan needed to be captured by the paratroops because they were there and everybody else was either being diverted to Cherbourg up the peninsula or west to stop the Germans from retreating. And they had to approach Carentan. The 502nd had to approach Carentan along this exposed causeway, this N13 highway. And the Germans, in an attempt to thwart parachute landing on the open fields around the N13 causeway, had flooded them with the rivers that had been diked. So this resulted in muddy swampland of cold water on either side of a raised highway. And of course the Germans to the west could see the silhouettes of men moving along this highway, and it turned into a gruesome slog very quickly. Back to the book. Occasional screams were heard as bullets found Cole's men one by one. Many were wounded and some killed, but the survivors kept edging forward. The fortunate ones who made it to the end of this gauntlet fanned out and dug in just north of Bridge Number 4. For troopers still strung out along the causeway, the long day dragged on, with German sharpshooters aiming for their heads. Lieutenants Bernie Klemantovich and George Larish of Company I were killed, while Ted Banowski of Company G survived with one eye shot out. Lieutenant John Payne-Schaub was seriously wounded and would be wounded again, this time mortally during the night. Before daylight, 2 German planes flew over the causeway, one dropping a bright parachute flare, illuminating the area like daylight. Another Ju-87 came north up the N-13 from Carentan, first strafing with its machine guns, then dropping anti-personnel bombs on the troops near the elevated road. This caused more casualties, although the strafing plane was shot down and reportedly crashed into one of the rivers. Near first light on June 11th, swarms of German machine gun bullets were periodically sweeping across the surface of the causeway, but Lieutenant Colonel Cole was walking up and down as if he were invincible, with a .45 pistol in his hand. Miraculously, the enemy fire did not hit him. He stood on the road above 3 of his item company troopers who were taking cover on the roadside ditch. "What's wrong, fellows?" Cole asked. "We're pinned down, sir." "Ah," Cole replied. "We're not pinned down. Come on, let's go get that son of a bitch." Chester Bob Elliott of Item 502 stood up, grasping his 40-pound light machine gun and carrying a partial belt of ammunition. "Where do you think you're going?" asked one of his companions. "Hell, if he's brave enough to lead us, I'm gonna follow him." Elliott crossed the 4th Bridge, accompanied by Cornelius Owens and Leroy Graville. They ran several hundred yards south to the east side of the road and met some bold 101st troopers who had already leapfrogged Cole's advance, as well as Captain Cecil Big Sec Simmons of Company H. Simmons greeted Elliott, saying, "Let me hold that machine gun for you while you catch your breath." Big Sec then sprayed about 150 rounds from it into the German-occupied hedgerow in a field across the west side of the N-13 road. Shortly after Simmons handed the weapon back to Elliott, a German bullet struck Owens in the upper chest, and as he lay dying, the 1st Battalion troopers began to fade back to the bridge. German troops were beginning to come round to the left, an end of the hedgerow in front of Elliott. He fired his LMG from the hip, mowing down a batch of them, quote, "like bowling pins." When Owens was confirmed dead, Elliott and Graville joined the retreat back to Bridge No. 4, which was being hit by German small arms and mortar fire. Elliott went down into the water and attempted to walk across the bottom of the Madeline River with the LMG on his shoulder. He started to drown and was forced to abandon the weapon in the river. He barely reached the opposite bank. "You damn near drowned," Lieutenant Colonel Cole said. Elliott was flat on his back, coughing up water. He couldn't talk, so he simply waved his hands from side to side, letting Cole know he would survive. By now, Item Company numbered less than 30 men. Cole ordered the remaining members of Item 502 to go up the causeway and remain in reserve. Lieutenant Robert Burns was the only Item Company officer still standing, but he and his survivors would circumvent Cole's order and manage to remain in the fight by mingling with the 1st Battalion troops later that day. In the meantime, mortar and artillery rounds were landing in the area. Then exploding smoke shells preceded a bayonet rush. During the unfolding drama, Lieutenant Pelfrey was wondering how he had gotten himself into such a predicament. Although it was hard to imagine getting away, he never really believed that he was going to be killed that day. As shells from both sides exploded around the prone men, Pelfrey heard one trooper talking out loud, even as he feigned death. "When is this son of a bitch gonna do something?" Then another, "Oh Lord, if you get me out of here alive, I swear I'll come to church every Sunday for the rest of my days. Why don't they do something?" Despite the gravity of the situation, Pelfrey couldn't help but smile at what he was hearing. But closer to the bridge, Cole was striding up and down his line of survivors, saying, "These goose-stepping heinies think they know how to fight a war. We're about to learn 'em a lesson. There's several thousand Krauts in front of us, and only a few hundred of us left, but we are all well able to take this thing. We can't even think about taking prisoners. I'm going to put such an artillery barrage on them that we hope they'll be addled. I want you to put your bayonets on your rifles. We'll call for smoke. When you hear me blow the whistle, get up and charge to the orchard behind that farmhouse. If your buddy gets hit, keep going. You can't afford to stop. Go ahead and smoke a cigarette. For some of you it'll be your last cigarette because some of you won't make it. When I blow the whistle, I want every one of you goddamn Jayhawks right on my ass." A smoke barrage followed, and there was some debate among survivors about how much artillery was directed into the German positions. Some swear that only 3 small pieces were being fired from Saint-Come-du-Mont. Others say that some naval artillery shells sent from the Channel by the USS Quincy II also landed in the area. Joe Lofthouse, one of Cole's radio operators, had long since discarded his entrenching shovel. During the seemingly endless wait for the signal to charge, he used his bayonet to dig a small hole, then lowered his head into it. Lofthouse felt that while he might survive a bullet in the butt, he did not want to get shot in the head. When the whistle blew, the charge got off to a rather ragged start. Some men hadn't heard the instructions. Others did not hear the whistle. But Lieutenant Colonel Cole led by example, running across the bullet-swept fields, brandishing his .45 automatic, which he fired in the general direction of the enemy. He could see only a fraction of his men at first, and some of those went to the ground. But he worked on them and got them up and running again. Gradually, more and more troops followed, with First Sergeant Spreacher leading Company H in the temporary absence of Captain Simmons, who had been knocked unconscious by a close mortar shell explosion. Spreacher was the first to reach the Ingloff farmhouse, and he shot the lock off the door. Cole and Major Stopka moved in to establish their command post inside as survivors of the charge continued west, engaging more German paratroopers in an apple orchard, where mail clerk Bob Brune and Lieutenant Edward Probst employed cold steel on several Germans to conserve ammunition. Brune was later killed in action, while Prof would suffer a bloody face wound. The lieutenant, still feeling the adrenaline, walked to the rear for first aid, shouting, "They squeal when you stick 'em." Cole's men fanned out to provide protection for their new battalion command post. Some, like Joe Lofthouse, ascended to the stairs and began firing out the second-floor windows towards the orchard. The field behind them was littered with the bodies of fallen comrades, both wounded and dead. Here, 3rd Battalion fought a touch-and-go battle all day. Meanwhile, 1st Battalion of Deuce had joined the fight, with Companies A and C continuing south on the main road, fighting at the Cabbage Patch along the west side of N13. After crossing Bridge No. 4, part of Baker Company under Lieutenant Homer Combs went west, past the Ingloff Farm, to hold the right flank for Cole. Fighting in a small complex of farm buildings known as the Pomerank Farm, they held off German attacks from the west for much of that day. Lieutenant Combs himself would be killed, as was Lieutenant Melvin M. Spruell, the forward observer for the 377th Artillery, who had assigned himself the job of infantry troop leader when his radio failed to function. Losses on both sides were so heavy that by the afternoon a ceasefire was necessary to pick up and evacuate the wounded. The extremely tall Major Doug Davidson, regimental surgeon of the 502 PIR, began his walk southward, way up the house at Dead Man's Corner, waving a white flag on a pole. An enlisted medic on either side of him. After crossing Bridge No. 4, the interpreted trio never missed a step, even with the Germans firing into the road beside their feet. Eventually they entered the German lines and proposed a German surrender. This was declined, but Davidson and the medics managed to achieve the necessary, albeit brief, ceasefire. The fighting resumed in earnest after Major Davidson recrossed the front line. It ended in late afternoon when the last German counterattack was dispersed by friendly artillery fire and the concentrated small arms fire of Cole's intrepid battalion. This bloody and historic day-long fight would open the way for other elements of the 101st Airborne Division to take and occupy the city of Carentan the following day. Cole was cited to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions, but would not live long enough to wear it. Moving on in the book, I want to end this podcast with a letter that Cecil L. Simmons, who was captain at the time of the bayonet charge on the N13 causeway, he wrote this letter home on the 25th of June, 1944, from the battlefield. It reads as follows. 25th June, 1944. Dear folks, the big guns are roaring, and our planes are in command of the skies, and Jerry, with his crack troops, are trying to throw us back into the sea. But he has American paratroopers to contend with, and we have our own ideas about being thrown anywhere. As a result, he is backing up to get a running jump at us, and each time he backs up, we keep him company. As you have read in the papers, we have had hand-to-hand and bayonet-to-bayonet combat, and have dug him out of his holes with just plain American intestinal fortitude and good fighting equipment. It might be interesting to note we have been awarded a presidential citation. Nice, huh? Write when you can. Love, Sec. And that's where I'm gonna end the reading from 101st Airborne, The Screaming Eagles in World War II by Mark Bando. And that is an incredible book. And I've only read the first part of it, only sections of the first part of it, because there's so much information, so much incredible photography in this book that you're going to have to get it for yourself if you like what you heard. It's this kind of history, I think, that does the best job at bringing military history to a broader audience, where individual actions are put within a larger framework by the historian, and then highlighted by quotes from the men who were there, punctuated with truly wonderful photography. Lieutenant Cole's bayonet charge there, late in the fight, really exemplifies American leadership and the guts of the American paratrooper. These men were volunteers to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, and in the 1940s, when most of these men had never been in an aircraft, let alone seen one before, that in itself is a truly daring feat. Then take into account the kind of job they had to do. It's no wonder that paratroopers have achieved a kind of mythical status among World War II military history today. If you want to study paratroopers of the Second World War, pick up this book. Check out Mark Bando's website and continue to support and listen to this podcast, where I'm going to bring you more and more paratrooper content. I'm also going to end this podcast on a different note, but a very exciting note. The Modern Military History channel is going to Europe. First to England, then to Belgium, and then into France, in time for the 74th anniversary of the June 6 landings and of these very actions. Me, Andy, I'm going to take my camera, and I'm going to be recording with still photography and video these very places that I brought to you today. Saint-Côme-du-Mont, the N13 Causeway, and Carentan, among many others. I'm also going to be traveling around Belgium, visiting many World War I and World War II battlefields. And that will come in segments as I make them. I'll be leaving in late April and coming back in early July. So it's a couple months away, and I've begun to really plan and get ready for my trip, but it's coming together. It will happen, and I will be bringing you content from the battlefields from which I have been reading this history. Because I feel that you cannot be a proper historian, you can't appreciate this history by just reading the words in a book. I've always had an interest in artifacts and in the words of veterans, but I want to feel the emotion of being there and try to understand exactly the landscape that defined these engagements, because like at the N13 Causeway, it was the geography itself that shaped the battle, along with the heroism of the men who fought there. It really does excite me to be able to bring this content to you. So keep following the Modern Military History channel. I'm going to bring more updates, a more detailed itinerary of my travels at a later date. But as of now, thank you so much for your continued support. Thank you to my subscribers. You guys, you make it all worthwhile. Thank you. And until next week, this has been the Modern Military History Podcast with Andy, signing off.